Chapter 15 of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. The Necklace of Pearls. The story of a water nymph and an island lad. In a tiny cottage on the steep rocky hillside of one of the islands of the Azores there lived a poor woman and her only son, whose name was Francisco. Every day the boy went fishing in his little boat, and every night he brought home fish for his mother to cook for their evening meal and to carry into the market to sell. In this way they lived very comfortably, and they loved each other so dearly that they were as happy can be. Francisco, with his fair skin, blue eyes, and thatch of curly golden hair, was the handsomest boy in the whole parish, and by the time he was 16 years old there was many a rich man's daughter who had smiled upon him. However, the lad thought only of his fishing boat and his mother, and did not notice the smiles. One night the moon was so bright that Francisco could not sleep. He awakened his mother, who was dozing comfortably in her bed. "I am going fishing, mother dear," he said as he kissed her. "The moonlight is calling me." His mother started up from her bed in terror and amazement. "Why, my boy, do you do such a thing as this?" she asked. "You have never been fishing in the night before. Some evil will surely befall you." "Don't worry about me, dear mother," replied Francisco, laughing at her fears. "I know how to take care of myself. It is as light as day. Think how many fish I'll bring back for you to sell in the market tomorrow." His mother shook her head anxiously, but with another loving kiss the lad ran out into the bright moonlight. He quickly launched his little fishing boat and soon was floating smoothly along on the peaceful waters of the bay, which gleamed like a silver pathway in the moonlight. The soft air, the gentle rocking of the little boat, and the face of the moon upon which his blue eyes were fixed, combined to send sleep to his eyelids. Soon he was nodding in the little boat. A few moments later and he was fast asleep. The moon's rays upon his curls made them shine as if they were indeed made of gold. Now the village maidens were not the only ones who had noticed Francisco's blue eyes and handsome face. A water nymph, who dwelt in the depths of the sea, had often observed him. In the daytime she was invisible to the eye of humans, and so the lad had never seen her, though she often spent long hours near him, never taking her eyes from his face. "Here comes a beautiful youth in his little fishing boat," cried the nymph as she saw the moonlight gleaming upon his bright curls. "At last my wish has come true. Now at night he'll be able to see me." She hastily arranged her own beautiful hair before a little mirror she carried. Some of the strands of priceless pearls which decked her lovely head were a trifle awry. These and the necklaces of rare pearls which hung from her fair throat surrounded her with a gleam of soft light, almost like the light of the moon. As she approached nearer to the little boat she saw that Francisco was fast asleep. She swam in the direction of the lad with all possible speed, a wild terror in her eyes. "What madness is this?" she asked as she looked down upon his bowed head. "This frail boat will drift upon the dangerous rocks and be dashed to pieces. I'll take him home to my own palace without awakening him. Perhaps when he sees how lovely it is he'll even like me a little bit." Just for a moment she hesitated, thinking how far from home Francisco would be in the palace of mother of pearl in the depths of the sea. "The rocks are really very dangerous," she said to herself as she gently drew his sleeping form into her arms. The next morning Francisco's empty fishing boat was found by the fishermen. For hours his mother had watched in vain for his return. When at last she heard that the empty boat had been found she was nearly wild with grief. "He was the best son and mother ever had," she moaned over and over again. "How can I live without him?" Indeed, as the days and weeks went by it was increasingly difficult for the poor woman to live. She not only missed her boy's loving smile, but she also missed the fish he caught so skillfully. There was little for the poor woman to eat, if she had any appetite for food. "Why don't you go to the wise man of the sea and tell him your troubles?" asked one of the neighbors. Francisco's mother knew that it was a long and difficult journey to reach the wise man of the sea. She decided, however, it would be worth the effort just to gaze into his wise eyes. He knew so much, perhaps he would know how to say something to comfort her in her great sorrow and loneliness. She had shrugged her shoulders when the neighbor had spoken of it, but she could not get the idea out of her mind. She knew that she would never rest in peace until she had made this journey. Accordingly, she launched Francisco's fishing boat and, thanks to smooth seas, reached the little rocky island in the midst of the sea where the wise man of the sea lived. His tall form was outlined above the cliff even as she tied her little boat. He was very tall, far taller than anybody she had ever seen, and his snow-white beard fell to his feet. He was clothed in fish scales, which gleamed in the sunlight. "Well, little mother, what can I do for you today?" he asked as she came up the path to the summit of the rock. The eyes of the wise man of the sea were very kind, as well as full of great wisdom. Francisco's mother forgot to be afraid of him, as she had expected to be. She told him the story of her lost son. The wise man listened carefully to her words, and then he said, "Good mother, I am glad to tell you that I know where your Francisco is. He is in the power of a water nymph who has carried him away to her castle of mother of pearl in the depths of the sea." Francisco's mother felt the tears of joy well up into her eyes. "Is my boy happy there, and is he well?" she asked eagerly. "He is entirely well and happy. The water nymph gave him a philter which has made him forget his past life entirely." "I'm glad you told me that," said the boy's mother. "I was just wondering how my dear lad could be happy while he was causing me so much sorrow. He has always been the best and kindest son with which a mother ever was blessed." The wise man of the sea started to say something, but the woman interrupted as a new thought flew into her mind. "Tell me," she cried, "is there no way of getting him back? With all your wisdom, can't you think of some way to make him once more remember the mother who loves him, and the little home in which we have passed so many happy days together? Do you not know some means of breaking the power which this water nymph has over him?" The wise man looked out across the sea in silence for at least a minute and a half. He thought hard. Francisco's mother watched him with eager eyes. She could hardly wait for his answer. At last these were the words which fell from his lips. "You have shed many tears, good woman, but tears are still to flow if you are to bring back your son." "Oh, must I suffer more?" cried the heartbroken mother. "It seems that I have already lived a lifetime since my dear lad kissed me in the moonlight. I have endured all that I can bear." The wise man smiled gently as he raised his hand. "Listen, my child," he said. "Your tears must be shed upon the bosom of the waters. If perchance one of them should fall upon your son's heart there in the palace of the water nymph in the depths of the sea, the power of her philter would be broken." "I'll shed whole oceans of tears if I can break the power of that water nymph and bring back my Francisco," said his mother. The fact is that she began to shed tears then and there, even before she had thanked the wise man of the sea for what he had told her. Now it happened that Francisco had grown to love the beautiful palace of mother of pearl in the depths of the sea. He never tired of all its beauty. About the palace there were lovely gardens filled with flowers made of precious gems. Each tiny bud of that garden was worth a king's ransom, so rich were the jewels which composed it. The water nymph often gathered her arms full of these rare blossoms and wove them into a garland to crown Francisco's golden curls. He never had a thought of his old life at home with his mother, so completely had the nymph's philter done its work. There was always a big fish swimming about the palace. On its back there was a cushion of sea green satin embroidered with lovely pearls. "This is your riding horse," said the water nymph to Francisco the first day he had seen it. "If you should ever get tired of the palace and find the life here a bit monotonous, just mount this horse and ride about for a little. The water nymph had shaken out her long fair tresses so that they covered as much as possible of the fish tail she had instead of feet. She was very sensitive about the fact that she had no feet upon which to wear pretty little slippers like those of the maidens she had seen so often as they called out gay greetings to the handsome fisher lad. Francisco had smiled into her eyes. "How absurd," he cried, "to think of such a thing as getting tired of this wonderful place." In fact, the days had slipped by all too fast for the happy youth. Then it suddenly happened one day while the water nymph was asleep that he thought of his mother, the little house which had been his home for 16 years and more, the fishing boat which was his pride and joy, the moonlight night when he had gaily kissed his mother's cheek and gone away never to return. He did not stop to waken the sleeping nymph. He said no word to the servants of the palace. He thought only of the fish with the cushion of sea green satin embroidered with rare pearls. "Quick," he cried to it, "take me home as fast as you can. My mother's heart is breaking. She has shed so many tears for me I know that by this time she may be entirely blind." In another hour Francisco was safe at home with his mother's arms about him. She had shed so many tears that her eyes were swollen almost shut, but they were not closed so completely that they could not shine with the great joy which once more filled her heart. "Promise me one thing," she said to him. "Give me your word that you'll never go fishing again. I don't trust that water nymph even in the daytime." Accordingly, Francisco gave up being a fisherman and became a hunter. To make his spears he gathered the young sapling which grew on the hillside even down to the edge of the water. He had grown still handsomer while he had lived in the palace of mother of pearl in the depths of the sea, and there were twice as many pretty maidens who cast smiling glances in his direction. It was the daughter of the rich man of the village who at last won the heart of Francisco. When he went a wooing, however, he had no gift to take except the birds he had killed with his own hand. The rich man laughed at him. These were his words: "When my daughter marries it shall be only to a youth who can bring her rich gifts." Francisco went away with a sad heart, and sat upon the rocks at the edge of the sea, gazing out over the water with eyes so full of tears that they saw nothing. The water nymph was not far away from the shore those days. She was always seeking for a glimpse of the golden head which she had so often crowned with flowers. Her joy now at the sight of him was buried by her sorrow when she saw that his heart was full of woe. She knew at once the cause of his grief. The next morning, when Francisco went to get wood to make a new spear, he found a necklace of priceless pearls lying on the shore. It was the gift of the water nymph, but since his heart had been touched by his mother's tears, he had entirely forgotten her. He took the gift to the maid he loved, with never a thought of the giver. End of chapter 15.
Of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Goss45. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. The Daughter of the King of Naples. The Story of a Prince's Quest. There was once a king who had an only son. The years passed by, and he did not marry. So one day his father called him before him and said, "The time has come when you should marry, my son. You are now at an age when you should no longer wait to choose your bride. Why is it that you have not already done this?" The prince replied, "I will wed no one except the daughter of the King of Naples." "Do you know that the King of Naples has a daughter?" asked the father. "No," answered the son, "I do not know." "I should advise you to find out whether or not the King of Naples happens to have a daughter before you decide to marry her," remarked the king dryly. "That is good advice," replied the prince. "I thank you." Accordingly, he asked everybody he met whether the King of Naples had a daughter. There was no person to be found who knew anything about it. "You'll have to go to Naples to obtain this information," advised the king. "But if you are determined to marry nobody except the daughter of the King of Naples, there seems to be no way except to go there and learn whether or not he has a daughter." Accordingly, a ship was prepared, and the prince sailed for Naples. It was a difficult, stormy voyage, but finally they arrived safely. The moment they landed, the beggars came crowding about them. The prince distributed alms among them most generously. Then he asked, "Does anyone know whether or not the king of Naples has a daughter?" There was nobody who knew. Finally, however, an old woman said that once she passed by the royal palace, and there was a beautiful face at the window.
"I think that perhaps this was the daughter of the king of Naples, but I do not know,"
she added. "Go at once and find out," ordered the prince. "You shall be richly rewarded." The old woman hastened to the royal palace. She saw the same lovely face at the window which she had seen before.
"Lovely lady, I want to talk to you," she called out.
Now it happened that day that the princess was feeling decidedly bored and out of tune with life. It looked like an interesting diversion to talk with the old woman. Thus it came to pass that she opened the window graciously. "What do you wish, good mother?" she asked.
"Are you the daughter of the king of Naples?"
questioned the old woman. "I am," replied the princess.
"May I come some day to sell you pretty things?"
asked the old woman. The princess appointed an hour the next day when she might come with her wares. Then the old woman hurried back to the waiting prince.
"The king of Naples has a daughter," she cried. "A very beautiful daughter, too."
The prince showered the woman with gold. He was so delighted that at last he had found this out that he could well afford to be generous. The old woman thanked him.
"I did something else for you, kind sir," she said. "I made an appointment to see the princess tomorrow. I am going to the palace at 4 o'clock to sell pretty things to her."
"Well done, good mother," cried the prince, again thrusting his hand into his purse. "Let me go in your place." The old woman gladly consented, and the prince dressed himself as a peddler. The next afternoon, at 4 o'clock, he went to the palace of the king of Naples.
"It is a peddler with many interesting wares for sale,"
said the servant who answered his knock.
"He speaks of an appointment with your royal highness."
"Yes," said the princess. "A peddler was to come today at 4 o'clock with pretty things for me to buy." Accordingly, the prince was admitted to the presence of the daughter of the king of Naples. If she were surprised to find the peddler a handsome young man instead of the old woman with whom she had talked the day before, she did not show it. "What lovely things you have!" she cried, as she examined the tray full of ribbons and beads and trinkets. She selected a number of the wares and then asked, "What is the price of these?" The prince would not set a price. "If your royal highness is pleased with these," said he, "I have many more things at home which you will like even better. I will bring them to you tomorrow." "That will be splendid!" cried the princess. "Come again tomorrow at this hour." The next day the prince again dressed himself as a peddler, but underneath the outer garments he wore his own rich clothing. When he was admitted to the royal palace, he laid aside his peddler's disguise and stood before the princess looking like the true prince he was. He was very handsome in his rich suit of crimson velvet, with his hat with the long plume in his hand. The princess was so surprised that she turned pale. "Who are you?" she cried. "You surely are not the peddler who came here yesterday." The prince smiled into her eyes, and, even without the peddler's garments which were rolled up on the tray, she would have recognized him. He told her of the quest which had led him there, and she admired all the patience and diligence he had shown in fighting out her existence. When he asked her to marry him at once, she readily consented. They planned that she would steal down the staircase at night and go away with him on his ship. All this sounded very romantic to the daughter of the king of Naples. She had never dreamed that a thing like this would ever happen. All her life she had been so closely guarded that stealing out of the palace and sailing away in the prince's ship seemed the most wonderful thing in the world. The next night had been agreed on, and long ahead of the appointed hour the prince sat on horseback at the foot of the stairway down which the princess would steal. He was very weary with all the excitement of the past 3 days, and as he waited he fell asleep. A robber passed by and saw his sleeping form hanging limply on the saddle. "I'll gently deposit him on the ground and get away with his horse and saddle," thought the thief, as he stopped and regarded the horse with a critical eye. Just then, however, he saw something which made him change his mind about hurrying away after he had deposited the prince's sleeping form beneath the tree. There was the loveliest maiden he had ever seen, creeping silently down the stairway. She came straight up to him. "I am ready, beloved," were her words. The robber silently lifted her behind him on the horse's back, and together they rode away. "Where is your boat?" asked the princess after they had ridden together for some time without speaking. "So it is a boat which the fair lady is looking for," thought the thief. "I was expecting this good horse to carry us the whole distance. A boat is a bit difficult to arrange, but it can be done if necessary. There ought to be a boat around somewhere for me to steal." He left the daughter of the king of Naples on the shore while he went to steal a boat. When he returned, the light shone upon his face, and the girl thought that he did not look the same as the day before. "Of course I've seen him only twice," she told herself in an effort to gain assurance. "It must be the prince, my own true love." "Here is our boat," said the robber, and together they embarked. As the morning light shone upon the robber, the princess saw that he was not in the least like the prince who had come a-peddling. The robber laughed. "Does my lady know with whom she is going away?" he asked. "I thought I was going with the prince who was my lover," she replied, bursting into bitter tears. Running away was not half so romantic and delightful as she had pictured it. She hardly wished that she were back in the royal palace. As for the prince, he soon awoke and looked about the palace garden where he was lying under the tree. "How did I get here?" he asked as he rubbed his eyes sleepily. There was none to tell him, so he decided that his horse must have thrown him off and run away. "It is queer that my fall did not awaken me," he said to himself. "It is a bit awkward to lose my horse. However, if the princess only keeps her promise and comes to me, we shall manage to get to our ship somehow." He waited patiently for a time, and then he began to fear that the princess had repented of her promise to run away. He did not give her up, however, until it was almost daylight. Then he sorrowfully returned to his waiting ship. "I have at least found out that the king of Naples has a daughter, and that she is the most beautiful princess in the whole world," he said. "If she prefers not to have a runaway marriage, it will doubtless be better for me to sail home and tell my father to make arrangements with the king of Naples for our wedding. There are some advantages in this more dignified method." Thus it happened that the prince sailed away for his own country, never dreaming that the princess had kept her promise to steal down the stairway in the night, and that she was then in the hands of the wicked robber. The daughter of the king of Naples sobbed and cried so loud when she found that it was not her own prince with whom she was sailing that the robber became quite disgusted with her. "I thought you were a pretty little maid," he said, "when I first saw you, but now I've changed my mind about you." Indeed, no person with good eyesight would have called the princess pretty at the moment, with her face all red and swollen with much weeping. The robber decided that he did not want to bother with her any longer, so he landed in the country of Junqueiras and left her there. The princess wandered about the place until night came without seeing a single soul, nothing but the sea, sky, and rocks. She was really, however, not far from the hut in which there lived the wife and daughter of a poor fisherman. In the stillness of the night they heard a cry. "Someone is in trouble outside, mother," said the daughter. "Perhaps the pirates have come and by this cry are trying to lure us out," answered her mother cautiously. There were often pirate ships which stopped there. The daughter listened carefully. "No, mother," she insisted. "I'm sure this is a girl's cry." The two women opened their door and crept out into the darkness. The sobs of the princess soon led them to the place upon the rocks where she lay crying as if her heart would break. They lifted her tenderly and carried her home. The fisherman's daughter gave the princess some of her own clothes to wear, and they lived together as if they were sisters. Together they did all the work of the little house, and the princess was too busy to weep. Sometimes, however, she cried in the night when the fisherman's wife and daughter were asleep. She wept for her lost love and for the royal palace of the king of Naples, which had always been her home. Now it happened that the prince's ship encountered a great storm and was driven about by the sea. At last it was blown by the gales to the land of the Junqueiras. The prince saw the fisherman's daughter and the princess standing on the rocks by the sea. He stared hard at the princess. Then he spoke in a voice which shook. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said. "Tell me your name, I pray you, fair maid." The princess looked down at the garments of the fisher maid which she wore. She blushed. The prince she had recognized the very moment she had seen him. "I am the daughter of the king of Naples." The fisherman's daughter stared at her in amazement. "She's no king's daughter," she cried. "This is a poor abandoned maid who came to us out of the sea. We found her upon these very rocks. It is my own dress that she is wearing. A king's daughter indeed. She is no more the daughter of the king of Naples than I am." But the prince had taken the daughter of the king of Naples into his arms. As soon as they returned to the palace, their wedding was celebrated with great joy, and they lived together as God lives with the angels. End of The Daughter of the King of Naples. Recording by Gos45. 17 of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gauss45. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. Maria of the Forest. The story of a king and his fate. Once upon a time there was a young king who went into the deep forest on a hunting expedition. He and his favorite page became separated from the rest of the party, and soon they realized that they were lost. As night approached, they found the rude hut of a charcoal burner and begged for permission to pass the night there. They were received most hospitably. Just at the hour of midnight, the king was awakened from his sleep by a voice. This is what it said. "Here in this hut is born tonight the maiden of your fate. You can't escape your lot, young king. Your fate for you will wait. 'Tis fate, 'tis fate, 'tis fate." The king turned over on his pillow and tried to sleep, but the strange voice kept ringing in his ears. He rose early. As soon as he saw the charcoal burner, the man said, "A baby daughter was born to me last night." "At what time?" asked the king. "It was just midnight," replied the charcoal burner. The king awakened his page and told him what had happened. "I refuse to wed any maid born in this poor hut," he said. "You must help me escape this fate." "What can I do about it?" asked the page, yawning. "You must steal this babe this very day and put it to death," said the king sternly. The page did not dare refuse, and easily obtained possession of the baby when no one was looking. He carried her away into the deep forest, but he did not have the heart to put an innocent babe to death. He left her in a hollow tree, wrapped up in the bright red sash she wore. When he had returned to the king, he confessed that he had been too tender-hearted to slay the baby. The king was angry. "Take me to the baby," he said. "I will do the deed myself." Though they searched long and faithfully, they were unable to find the hollow tree where the baby had been left. They, of course, did not wish to return to the hut of their charcoal burner, and at length they found their way out of the deep forest. "No one will ever discover that baby if I could not find it myself. She will soon die without food," said the page. The king agreed that it was quite impossible for the babe to escape death, but he could not forget the strange voice which had said, "Here in this hut is born tonight the maiden of your fate. You can't escape your lot, young king. Your fate for you will wait. 'Tis fate, 'tis fate, 'tis fate." Now it happened that very day that a woodcutter was working in the forest. Suddenly he heard what sounded like the cry of a baby. "There can't be a child here in the deep forest," he said to himself, and went on with his work. The cry continued, however, and it sounded very near, almost under the woodcutter's feet. He looked into the hollow log, and there he found a dimpled baby girl wrapped in a bright red sash. "Poor little thing, her own mother has abandoned her. My good wife will be a mother to her," he said. The woodcutter's wife had no children of her own, and received the baby gladly. She named her Maria of the Forest. As the days flew by, the babe thrived under her care, and she would not have loved her more had she been her own child. The weeks and months passed, and soon the little Maria of the Forest had grown into a lovely little girl of 5 years old. Her kind foster mother made a bonnet for her out of the bright red sash which she had found wrapped about her the first time she saw her. It made Maria's dark eyes look even brighter than before. Now it happened that the king and his page were again hunting in the forest and passed by the house of the woodcutter. The page noticed the pretty little girl and the red bonnet she wore. He called her to him and examined it carefully. "There can be no doubt that material is from my own red sash," he confessed to the king. "The woodcutter's daughter could not have such a bonnet as this in no other way." The king bade him make inquiries about the child, and soon the page found out that the little maid was in truth the baby he had left in the hollow tree. The king ordered him again to steal her. This time the king plotted her death by drowning. He had a box made for her, put her in it, and threw her into the sea with his own hand. "I refuse to wed any girl brought up in a woodcutter's hut," he raged. "I'll escape this fate." Nevertheless, he could not escape the memory of the strange voice which had said, "Here in this hut is born tonight the maiden of your fate. You can't escape your lot, young king. Your fate for you will wait. 'Tis fate, 'tis fate, 'tis fate." It was most annoying to remember it. It happened soon after that a ship encountered the box floating upon the sea. The sailors rescued it and opened it with interest. Inside they were surprised to find a pretty little dark-eyed girl with a bright red bonnet on her head. She could not tell them where she had come from, but she said her name was Maria of the Forest. When the sailors arrived in their own country, they told the story of finding the child, and the king asked to see her. He and the queen were so pleased with her lovely face and gentle manners that they received her in the royal palace. She was brought up as a lady of waiting to their own little daughter of about the same age. Then, after a dozen years, the princess was wedded, and the kings of nearby countries were invited to the marriage feast. The king who had been lost in the forest came with the others. At the feast there was no one more beautiful than Maria of the Forest. The king danced with her. "Who is this girl?" was his eager question. "She has been reared in the royal palace as if she were in truth the sister of the bride," was the reply. The king fell in love with the beautiful maid and gave her a ring. The page, however, was suspicious when he heard her name. He lost no time in making inquiries about her. What he found out made him very sure that she was in truth the daughter of the charcoal burner. He reported his suspicions to the king. "Never mind," said the king. "I'll wed the maid anyway. One can't escape from one's fate." End of Maria of the Forests. Recording by Gus45.
Of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. The Seven Enchanted Princes. The story of how Honoria kept her promise. Long ago there was a little maid who lived all alone with her grandmother. They were very poor. The girl's name was Honoria. One day the grandmother sent the girl out to sell some of the oranges from their orange tree. "You must bring home at least 3 vintens to me," she said. "Don't dare return without at least that small amount of money." Honoria went from door to door trying to sell the oranges. Everyone seemed to have plenty of them that day. There was nobody who would purchase a single one. She walked on and on through the town, everywhere obtaining the same answer: "We do not wish to purchase any oranges today." Finally she found herself outside the town and in the forest. There was a house with the door wide open, and on the table in front of the door lay 3 vintens. There was no one in sight, and nobody answered Honoria's knock at the door. "I'll take the money and leave some oranges in place of it," said Honoria. "That will not be stealing." Accordingly, she selected some of the largest and finest of her oranges and placed them on the table. She put the money away carefully to take to her grandmother. Then she turned to leave, but found that the door was closed. She tried her best to open it, but could not. Neither could she open any of the windows to climb out by that means. The windows were all fastened just as securely as the door. "What shall I do?" cried the girl, who was now thoroughly frightened. She did not like the idea of remaining a prisoner in the house in the forest. All day she tried to find some way of escape, but there seemed nothing to do except to wait until somebody came to her aid. "This house is not far from the city. Surely someone will be passing this way and will come and help get me out," said Honoria. "I hope they'll come before night." There was nothing to eat in the house, and she was thankful enough for the big basket full of juicy oranges. At last it grew dark. Then Honoria heard footsteps outside the house. She could not see who was coming, but a key turned in the lock, and someone entered. She was so frightened that she hid under the table. A lighted candle showed that 7 dwarfs entered the house. They had brought food with them, and they at once went to work to prepare their evening meal. "Who left us all these fine oranges?" asked one of the dwarfs. "I do not know," replied another. "Someone has surely been here, and it must have been a kind friend." Honoria was almost tempted to crawl from under the table and show herself, but she decided it would be better to stay where she was and go home the next day when it was light. When morning came, however, she found that she had been sleeping so soundly that she had not heard the 7 dwarfs when they left the house. The door was fastened just as securely as before. Honoria looked about the house and saw there was enough work to keep her busy all day. There were dishes to wash, and floors to sweep, and beds to make. Fortunately the dwarfs had left plenty of food. When night came she heard the footsteps approaching and again hid under the table. As soon as the 7 dwarfs came into the house they saw that it had been changed wonderfully during their absence. "Our dishes are all washed," cried one of the dwarfs. "Last night we forgot to wash them after supper." "Our beds are all made," cried another. "We left home so early this morning we did not have time to make them." "Our floors are all swept and everything is in order," cried another. "We never have looked so neat and clean." "Somebody must have been here," said one of the dwarfs. "It is surely a kind friend," said another. "Perhaps they are here yet," cried another. "If they are men we'll treat them like brothers, and if they are women we'll treat them like sisters," said the 7th dwarf, who had not spoken before. He had been looking around the house carefully, but he had seen no one. Honoria crawled out from under the table. The dwarfs joined hands and danced around her in a circle. "We have a big sister now," they cried. "A big sister to take care of us." Honoria knew that if she said anything about leaving, the dwarfs would be heartbroken. She knew, too, that her grandmother would give her a terrible beating for staying away from home so long. The easiest thing seemed to be to remain in the forest and keep house for the 7 dwarfs. Weeks and months went by and Honoria led a happy life in the forest. The dwarfs brought home plenty of delicious food, and they also brought her the prettiest dresses she had ever seen. They were green like the moss and the leaves of the forest, and brown like the rich earth about the house. There was a little hat with red berries upon it, which Honoria thought the most charming hat in the world. She tried it on and ran to the brook to look at her reflection, for there was not a single mirror in the house. One day the king passed by with his gay hunting party. That day Honoria had on her prettiest moss green dress, and the king thought her the loveliest maiden he had ever seen. He stopped to chat with her. "Do you live here in the forest all alone?" he asked. "No, I keep house for my 7 brothers," was Honoria's answer. "What a lovely little housekeeper!" cried the king. "Marry me and come and live in the royal palace." "I must ask my brothers first," responded Honoria. "I will tell you tomorrow what they say." That night when the 7 dwarfs came home Honoria told them about her visit from the king. "How can we spare our big sister?" cried one of the dwarfs. "Who will keep house for us when she goes away?" cried another. "Who will make the beds so nicely?" asked another. "Who will sweep our floors? Who will wash our dishes? Who will sew on our buttons?" "I have known that our big sister would marry sometime," said the 7th dwarf, who had not spoken, but who had been thinking quietly. "Why shouldn't she marry the king?" "We must let her marry the king. We must not be selfish," cried all the dwarfs together. They decided that Honoria should marry the king, but they asked her not to let him kiss her until he had first said these words, "By permission of the 7 enchanted princes." He would have to remember it without being reminded by Honoria. Honoria told the king what her brothers had said, and the wedding was celebrated with great joy. When the king tried to kiss Honoria, she burst into tears. He had forgotten all about saying by permission of the 7 enchanted princes. Honoria would not let the king kiss her, and she cried so much and struggled so hard that the king thought she had gone crazy. He ordered her shut up in the dark cell underneath the palace. Then he married a new queen. Now it happened that there was a faithful servant who was quite sure that Honoria was not crazy. When Honoria told her of the words which the king must say before he kissed her, this servant tried to think of some way to help her. She was very angry at the fact that there was a new queen. One day she went to the queen and said, "Queen Honoria, who is shut up in the dark cell underneath the palace, is much more clever than you are." "What does Queen Honoria do that's so clever?" asked the new queen. "Queen Honoria will take a sword and cut off her head. Then she will put it back on again so it is as good as new. I don't believe you are clever enough to do that." "I never tried it," answered the new queen, "but just to show you that I'm as clever as Queen Honoria, I'll do it." With these words she seized a sword and cut off her head. Of course she fell dead immediately. The king married a new queen. Then the servant went to the new queen and said, "Queen Honoria, who is shut up in the dark cell underneath the palace, is more clever than you are." The new queen was indignant at this remark. "Why is she more clever than I am?" she asked. "What can she do that I can't do?" "She can take a sword and cut off her hand. Then she'll stick the hand on again and it will be as good as new." "I've never tried it, but I'll do it just to convince you that I am clever too," said this new queen. She took up a sword and cut off her right hand. Then she fainted away. The arm grew full of poison, and the queen soon died, but not until she had told the king what the servant had said to her. The king was very angry at the servant and called her to him. "What do you mean," he thundered, "by telling such a story about Queen Honoria's magic powers?" "I wanted you to remember where you had found Queen Honoria," replied the servant. Then the king suddenly remembered how he had first seen Queen Honoria when she was in the house in the forest. He thought of how pretty she had been in the dress which looked like soft green moss. Then he thought of how she had said that she must ask permission of her 7 brothers before she consented to become his queen. "By permission of the 7 enchanted princes," he cried. "I forgot to say these words before I kissed my dear Queen Honoria." He quickly ran to the dark cell underneath the palace where she was confined. He said the magic words and kissed his fair queen, who was just as beautiful as before she had been shut up in the cell, though a trifle paler. In the house in the forest, the 7 dwarfs, who were in truth 7 enchanted princes, suddenly were disenchanted. "Our dear sister Honoria did not forget us after all," they cried in joy. End of chapter 18. The 7 Enchanted Princes.
Of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. The Listening King. The story of the trouble which came to him. Once upon a time there lived a king who liked to walk in disguise about the streets of the city, listening at people's doors. It was, in fact, his favorite amusement. Other kings of that land had been fond of war, or hunting, or fishing, or games, but there had never before been one who liked to listen at doors. For this reason he was called the Listening King. "It is the greatest fun I have," he often said to his counselors. "Being a king would be a stupid life if one didn't have some diversion." "Be careful that it does not get you into trouble," said the wise men. "We have often heard that listening to other people's secrets is a dangerous practice." "I've had nothing but pleasure from it anyway," the king would reply. Then he would add, "So far, at least." Sometimes he would take a friend or 2 with him, and sometimes he would go alone. The habit of listening at doors became more and more a favorite one to him as the months and years passed. Now in that city there lived a man of humble station who had 3 pretty daughters. One evening the king passed his house and stopped at the door to listen. "Whom would you like to marry?" one of the girls was asking. It happened to be the youngest one. "I'd like to marry the royal baker," the eldest sister replied. "Why?" asked the youngest one. "So that I might always eat fresh bread," was the reply. "Whom would you like to marry?" the youngest sister asked the middle one. "I'd like to marry the royal meat cook, so that I might always eat meat roasted just to a turn," was her answer. "Whom would you like to marry?" asked the eldest and middle sister together. "I'd like to marry the Listening King himself," was the reply which their youngest sister made. "Silly, silly!" cried her 2 sisters. "We have perhaps a chance of getting our wishes, but what chance have you?" "If one wishes for nothing splendid, one never gets anything splendid," replied the youngest sister with a blush which made her look very charming to the king as he peeped through the keyhole. The king went away with a shrewd smile upon his face. The next day he sent for the 3 sisters to come to the palace. They were very much frightened. "Well," said the king to the eldest girl, "do you want to marry the royal baker?" "Yes, your majesty," she replied. "I have no objections." The king turned to her sister. "How is it with you?" he asked. "What do you say to marrying the royal meat cook?" "I'd be most happy to marry him, your majesty," she answered. The youngest girl was blushing like a rose, and her heart was thumping so that she could scarcely breathe. The king smiled as he noticed her fair head bowed upon her breast. "Would you like to marry the listening king?" he asked her gently. "Yes, your majesty," she responded so low that the king could hardly hear her. "Very well," said the king. "I'll have all these weddings celebrated at once." Thus it happened that the 2 eldest sisters got their wishes and married the royal baker and the royal meat cook, while the youngest one wedded the listening king himself. The others were very angry at her luck, and their hearts were filled with envy. "Why didn't we wish to be queens or at least princesses?" one asked the other. "It would have been just as easy to have had our wishes granted." "Why didn't we? Why didn't we? How stupid we were!" cried the other. They passed the time in plotting against their youngest sister, the queen. A year flew by, and twin sons were born to the royal pair. They had gold stars on their foreheads. The whole kingdom was filled with rejoicing. As for the listening king, he was so happy that he forgot to listen at people's doors. The only persons in the whole country who were not happy were the 2 jealous sisters. They stole the tiny babies out of the palace and threw them into the river. "Trouble has at last come to our listening king," said the wise men, when the loss was discovered. The basket in which the twins had been placed floated away down the stream. It was found by a miller. "What have we here?" he asked his wife, as together they removed the cover from the basket. "I guess it is something good to eat," said his wife. "What do you think it is?" "I guess it is a poor little puppy which someone wanted to drown," replied the miller. Then they took the cover off the basket. The 2 babies opened their eyes and smiled just then. The miller and his wife were the most surprised people in the whole country, and also the happiest ones. "What beautiful children!" cried the miller. "Let's keep them!" cried his wife. "Of course we'll keep them," replied the miller. "The good God himself must have sent them to us in answer to our prayers." Just then the miller's wife noticed the golden stars upon their foreheads. "What does this mean?" she asked. "I don't know," answered her husband, as he examined them carefully. "Perhaps it is just a sign that they are truly the gift of God." The miller and his wife cared for the 2 children as if they had been their own. They lived such a long distance from the palace that they never heard the news that the royal babies were missing. As the 2 boys grew older, they became the handsomest, cleverest lads in the whole kingdom. The gold stars shone and twinkled upon their foreheads. At last, the miller's wife made little caps for them to wear to hide the stars. They were altogether too conspicuous. Then, one sad summer, a pestilence came upon the land, and the good miller and his wife died. The 2 children were left alone in the world. The listening king had decreed all the orphan children in the kingdom should be brought to the royal city, that they might be fed and cared for. The miller's 2 orphans went with the others, and the king's wicked sister-in-laws saw them. They recognized them at once because of the golden stars upon their foreheads. "We must make a new plot to destroy the royal children," said one sister to the other, "and we must be quick about it, or the king or queen will see them and recognize them too by the golden stars." "Are you quite sure these are the 2 royal babes we threw into the river?" asked the other sister doubtfully. "It is a bit difficult for me to believe that our sister's children can be so handsome." "I'm entirely certain of it," assured her sister. "There is no one except the royal babes who could have those golden stars." While the wicked sisters plotted, the 2 children had approached the royal gardens. Inside the garden there was a beautiful parrot with feathers of green and gold. "I'm going to catch that bird," said one of the brothers. "Wait here while I go inside the gates." He could not catch the parrot, and he called his brother to come and help him. Together they succeeded, and with a beautiful green and gold parrot tightly clutched, they tried to slip outside the gate of the royal gardens. Just as they were almost out, the great gate swiftly closed and caught their garments. "We're caught! We're caught!" cried the two children. "How can we ever get the gates unfastened?" At the sound of their cries, the royal gardeners, the courtiers, and the listening king himself came to the rescue. When the king saw the golden stars upon their foreheads, he leaned against the nearest tree for support. "What children are these?" he asked in a voice which shook. "I never saw them before," replied the head gardener. "I think they are some of the orphan children which the great mercy and clemency of your royal majesty have caused to be rescued from the plague." "Who are your parents, my children?" asked one of the courtiers. "We are the children of the good miller and his wife," they replied. "Our kind foster parents are now dead with the plague." "Where did this miller and his wife find you?" asked the king eagerly. Then the two children told the story of how the miller had found them in a basket in the river. They knew it well, for it was their favorite story of all the ones which the miller's wife had told them. The courtiers looked at each other in amazement. Everyone had noticed the bright stars shining on the children's brows. "I believe you are the two dear babes lost from this palace," cried the king as he took them in his arms. "Who put them in that basket?" asked the king's counselors. "If I knew, you may be sure that fitting punishment would be visited upon them," cried the king. The beautiful green and gold parrot had escaped from the children's arms, and had flown back to a tree near the gates of the royal gardens. Suddenly he was heard to speak. "Go find the king's sisters-in-law," were the words he said. The king's sisters-in-law were quickly brought into the garden. A look at their guilty faces convinced everyone that they were the ones who had placed the royal babes in the basket and thrown them into the river. "You shall now receive the punishment which you have so richly deserved," cried the king as he frowned upon them sternly. "Where is the good queen?" someone asked. The queen had been sleeping in her own apartments and had not heard the noise in the garden. When the courtiers brought her there, and she saw the two handsome boys with the bright stars shining on their foreheads, she fainted with the joy of it. End of Chapter 19. The Listening King. The Story of the Trouble Which Came to Him. Read by Samuel Perry.
Of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. Chapter 20. Jose the Beast Slayer. The story of a boy who grew up in the forest. There once was a king who had a little daughter. He went to the wise man of the forest to learn how best to bring her up, and this is what he was told. "For 12 years you must keep your daughter in a tower in the forest. It should have no door, only a little window through which you may pass food to her. You must give her meat which has no bones in it." The king ordered a tower constructed in the deep forest. It had no door and only a little window. Here the princess was placed. Every day food was passed to her through the little window. The king himself took charge of this, so that he might be sure that there was no meat given her which had bones in it. The years flew by, and at last the 12-year period was nearly up. Then the king went away one day and left the servants to carry food to the princess. They were careless, and gave her meat which had a bone in it. The little princess had grown very tired of being shut up in the tower of the forest.
"Ah,"
said she when she discovered the bone in her meat,
"at last I have something with which to make this little window larger. I've tried in vain to make it bigger with my fingers."
She used the bone to dig away the wall each side of the window, and soon the little opening had grown so large that the princess could lean her head out of it and look up at lofty trees. That very day a duke passed that way on a hunting expedition and saw the beautiful princess in the tower. He fell in love with her immediately. Now that the princess had someone to help her make the hole larger, it was an easy matter to make it big enough to escape. That very night she ran away with the duke. When the king returned from his journey, he found the tower in the forest entirely empty. There was nothing but the yawning hole to tell him of his daughter's escape. He tried in vain to find out what had become of her, but there was no person who could tell him anything about her. The princess had gone with the duke across a great river, which no one else knew how to cross. She lived in a big cave in the rocks, and after all the years in the tower, it seemed a wonderful home indeed. She was never tired of admiring the trees and flowers of the forest and listening to the songs of the birds. When at last her baby son was born, she thought that she was the very happiest person in the whole world. Now, when the baby was 2 years old, the duke decided that they must take him to a hermitage to be baptized. They went down to the great river, and he carried his little son across it in safety. Then he returned for the princess, but on the way his foot slipped, and he fell into the river. The strong current bore him swiftly away, leaving the princess on one side of the river and her little son on the other.
"How shall I get across?"
cried the princess when she saw what had happened.
"Don't worry, Mother,"
replied the child.
"I'll come and get you."
To her amazement, he crossed the great river in safety and bravely escorted his mother to the other bank in spite of her tears and cries of fear.
"Well done, my son,"
she said when on the other bank.
"You are indeed a son to be proud of."
They went to a church, and the boy was baptized. Jose the Beast Slayer was the name he chose. Then they wandered on until at last they came to a house with a door in which a little window had been cut. The boy thrust in his arm and opened the door as if it had been his own.
"Walk in, mother dear,"
were his words. Together they entered the house, and together they explored the various rooms. There was nobody there, and there was nothing to eat. Accordingly, Jose went out begging. He asked alms at the royal palace, and there he was given money to buy food. There was even enough left over to pay for a gun. Now that he owned a gun, there was no need of begging any more. He shot plenty of game for his mother, and what was left he carried to the royal palace to give to the king. One day, in the deep forest, he entered a cave where the giant of the forest lived.
"What are you doing here, little penny chicken?"
asked the huge giant as he frowned down at Jose.
"I may be a little penny chicken, but I'm not in the least afraid of giants,"
replied the boy boldly.
"What? A little penny chicken like you, not afraid of me?"
cried the giant as he picked him up roughly and set him on his neck. Jose seized the giant's long beard and drew it around his neck so tightly that the giant fell to the floor dead. Then Jose seized one of the money bags and ran home with it to his mother.
"You must carry some of this to the king,"
said his mother when she saw it and had heard his story. Accordingly, Jose carried the money as a gift to the king.
"Who is bringing me all this?"
asked the king when he saw it.
"A little lad,"
replied the king's servants.
"Lead him in to me,"
said the king.
"I'd like to see him."
Accordingly, the boy was led before the throne.
"What is your name, my lad?"
asked the king kindly.
"I am called Jose the Beast Slayer, your majesty,"
replied the boy as he bowed low before the throne.
"Who are your parents?"
asked the king.
"My father is dead,"
replied Jose.
"and my mother is a princess who ran away from a tower in the forest."
Jose had often heard the story of his mother's life in the tower. It was the tale he liked best of all. At the boy's words, the king started and looked at him sharply.
"Tell me about this tower,"
he said eagerly.
"It was a tower in the deep forest," replied Jose. "It had no door, only a little window through which food was passed to her. She could never have any meat with a bone. This was because the wise man of the forest had told her father that it was the best way to bring her up. One day her father went away, and the servants gave her meat with a bone in it, and—"
"I always suspected something like that,"
interrupted the king. Jose looked at him in surprise.
"Were you there?"
he asked. The king nodded.
"Go on with your story, my boy,"
he said. Jose told all the circumstances of his mother's escape from the tower, just as she had so often described them to him. Tears were running down the king's cheeks when at last the story was ended.
"My lad, you are my own grandson,"
cried the king as he took him in his arms.
"Proud am I, too, that I have a grandson like you. Where is your mother now?"
"My mother is in the house in the forest," replied Jose. "It is she who told me to carry the money to the king."
"Why did she never come to me?"
asked the father.
"I think she was afraid she'd be punished for running away from the tower without any door,"
was Jose's reply. When the princess was brought home to the royal palace, there was a great feast held, which lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. Then the king sent his men with Jose into the forest to the cave where the giant had lived. They brought home so many bags of gold that it required the entire royal army to transport it. Years passed, and when the old king died, it was Jose the Beast Slayer who was king of the land. End of chapter 20.
The Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daphnis. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. The Princess and the Lost Island. The story of Euphemia and her good deeds. Euphemia was the daughter of King Atlas and the granddaughter of the great god Jupiter. She was more beautiful than her 15 sisters, though they were all lovely. All the 10 sons of Neptune admired her charms and sought to marry her, but she would wed none of them. There was, in truth, no one in all the world who was worthy of her. Euphemia herself knew this, and preferred to remain a star in the constellation of the Hyades, her sisters, rather than wed an unworthy husband. Euphemia became a Christian, they say, through the efforts of the cherubim. She decided to come down to earth and go about doing good deeds. Accordingly, she came to the island called 7 Cities. Now, in the island of 7 Cities, there lived a rich and venerable Christian prince. He adopted Euphemia as his own daughter. She was called Princess Euphemia of the island of 7 Cities. As soon as she came to the island, all pain and misery vanished from it. Joy reigned, banquets were held, songs were sung, gay dances were danced. It was as if every day were a feast day. Time passed. Many changes came to the island, but Euphemia herself remained always young, always beautiful. One day 2 priests from the outside world visited the island. They saw the magnificent palaces, the beautiful gardens. 2 tame lions followed them about. They were as gentle as if they had been dogs. "We are in the celestial region," said one priest to the other. "Let us stay here forever," said the other priest. "It is indeed the paradise of which we have dreamed." The 2 priests had come in a tiny launch from a large boat. "We should return and tell our friends about this celestial region," they agreed. "Tomorrow we will all explore this wonderful country." It was almost dark when the 2 priests reached their ship by the little launch. They reported all the things they had heard and seen in the new land. The next morning, however, the island had entirely disappeared. The water stretched before their gaze with an unbroken, rippling blue surface. "What has become of our beautiful island?" the good priestess asked in amazement. "We were anchored off the shore of one of the enchanted islands," was the opinion of everybody. "Euphemia, they say, has not yet disappeared entirely. She has changed her form. She is still found in the Azores in the plants called Solanea, the power of Saint Cosmo. She is still doing good deeds. Pain disappears when she comes, just as it did in the Lost Island. Saint Cosmo, the patron saint of all good physicians, could never have gained his reputation without her good deeds." End of The Princess and the Lost Island. Recording by Daphnis.
22 of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra Luna. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. Why the Alvéloa Bird Received a Blessing. The Story of the Bird of Good Luck. In the Azores there is a little bird which is loved and protected by everyone. Its name is the Alvéloa. It has a gray back, white breast, head and throat, and black and white wings. The tail of this little bird is always in motion. This is the reason. Long ago, when the wicked King Herod ordered all the babies to be killed, the Holy Virgin fled into Egypt with the Christ child safe in her arms. They rode upon an ass. The Virgin glanced fearfully behind her as they went along the way. At any moment Herod's messengers might come in pursuit. The tracks of the ass showed plainly in the dusty road. "Oh," cried the Holy Mother, "our enemies will see our tracks. They will know in what direction we have fled." The Alvéloa was near by and heard. She spread out her tail like a fan and shook it about in the dusty road. The tracks of the ass were completely brushed away. The Holy Mother smiled upon her. "For this kind deed, little bird, your tail shall be always in motion. By this sign you shall be known, and your life shall be spared." To this very day the tail of the Alvéloa is in motion. Saint Michael himself, the patron of the island of São Miguel, has asked a special protection for the little bird in his island. The Alvéloa flew all the way before the Virgin, showing her the road into Egypt. "My blessing upon you, little bird," said the Virgin. "May you always have the strength to slay your enemy." To this very day the Alvéloa is able to slay birds much larger than herself. "The Alvéloa kills the hawk," is a saying in the Azores. If one wakes in the morning and sees this little gray and white bird before his window, he will have a lucky day. On the way into Egypt the Virgin pointed to the lupine which grew by the wayside. "Eat, little bird," she said. "Eat until your hunger is satisfied. Blessings be upon you for your kind deeds to me and to the Holy Child. May good fortune and plenty always attend you." To this very day this bird blessed by the Virgin is an emblem of good luck. End of Why the Alvéloa Bird Received a Blessing. Recording by Sandra Luna.
23 of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Krantz. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. Why the Codorniz Bird Received a Curse. A story of the bird who walks humbly. When the Holy Virgin was fleeing into Egypt to escape the persecutions of Herod, the Codorniz bird flew about making a great racket, calling out, "Come this way!" "Keep quiet!" cried the Virgin. "Our enemies will hear you. They will come in pursuit." In spite of her words, the Codorniz kept up its noise. "My curse be upon you," said the Virgin. "You shall always walk humbly. You shall never fly high and smile at the sun." To this very day the Codorniz bird walks humbly. It has many enemies who love to slay it to devour. End of Why the Codorniz Bird Received a Curse. Recording by Pamela Krantz.
Chapter 24 of The Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. Chapter 24. Outside the Door Like the Mother of St. Peter. A story of why she stays outside. If there is no response when you ring the bell or knock at a door in the Azores, you have to stay outside the door like the Mother of St. Peter, they say. This is the story which tells why the Mother of St. Peter had to stay outside. The very stingiest woman in the whole city was St. Peter's mother. She was so stingy that she never gave away a single thing to a beggar. No matter if the beggar were old or sick or blind or crippled, or even a mother with a babe in her arms, she always made the same reply: "I have nothing to give away." Not even when there was a famine in the land, but plenty in her own home, would the Mother of St. Peter share with the unfortunate. When St. Peter was made the guardian of the keys of heaven, of course he tried to bring his mother inside the celestial gate. When your mother lived upon the earth, did she ever share her plenty with any of my poor unfortunate children? Was the question. St. Peter thought hard. His mother had been a worthy, virtuous woman in many respects, but he could recall nothing which she had ever given to the poor and the unfortunate. At last he remembered a day when she had gone into the garden to get vegetables for the soup. A poor beggar woman had stood outside the garden gate crying, "Alms, alms, for the love of God." "Get away from my garden," said St. Peter's mother. "I have no alms to give you. If I give away the vegetables from my garden, I'd soon have nothing left to feed my own family. I'd be begging myself." The poor beggar woman started to turn away with tears in her eyes. An onion stalk fell from the hand of St. Peter's mother. It was bruised by its fall and covered with mud, but the beggar seized it eagerly. "Keep it. I wouldn't use it anyway," snapped St. Peter's mother. St. Peter could remember nothing else to tell, so he related this story. "Go and find the onion," was the comment. When St. Peter at last found that onion stalk, it was still dirty with the mud of the garden and crumpled by its fall, just as it had been when his mother had given it to the beggar. "Hold out the onion and pull your mother in," was the order. St. Peter held out the onion stalk. It did not reach very far down into purgatory, but his mother jumped up as high as she could and seized it eagerly. Slowly and very carefully he pulled her up by it to the heavenly gate. Just as she was about to enter the door the onion stalk broke. "I'm sorry. You'll have to stay outside," said St. Peter. "I've done the best I could for you. The onion stalk was not strong enough to pull you through. Thus it happens that the Mother of St. Peter has to stay outside the door of heaven." End of chapter 24. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah.
Of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. Why the Owl Flies at Night. A Story of Good St. Anthony. Long ago there was an image of the good St. Anthony washed ashore by the rough waves of the Bay of Angra. A little chapel was built to receive it on the steep slopes of Monte Brasil overlooking the bay, and here it still remains. Once upon a time a little boy named Pedro lived in a tiny cottage near St. Anthony's shrine. His mother had died, and his father had married a new wife who was often cruel to him. She dressed him in ragged, shabby clothes, and the other children of the parish often pointed their fingers at him in scorn because of his poor garments. One day, as Pedro knelt before the image of the good saint, a strange thing happened. His clothing became new and whole. He was dressed as well as any boy in the parish. "Where did you get clothes like this?" asked the stepmother when he came home that night. "I always knew you were a good for nothing. I believe you have stolen them." Little Pedro told what had happened, but the woman would not believe him. "Don't stand there talking any longer," she cried. "Take the water jars and go to the spring and fill them for me. Hurry, I don't want to be kept waiting for the water." Pedro lifted the two great water jars which stood on the floor, and slowly climbed up the hill to the little spring which supplied water for the family needs during the greater part of the year. Just now the spring had failed, as the stepmother had found out that very day. "There is no water in the spring now," said an old man whom little Pedro met on the way. The boy had almost reached the spring and the big jars were growing heavy even though they were empty. "I'm so nearly there I'll go on and see for myself," decided the lad. "The other spring is so far away and the jars will be so heavy that I can never carry them all the long distance. Perhaps there is still a little water here." When he reached the spring he was surprised to see the water flowing faster than in many a day. He remembered, too, the new suit of clothes he was wearing. "Luck is with me today," he cried as he filled the water jars. "The good Saint Anthony is my friend. He it is who has given me my handsome clothing, and he it is who has blessed the spring for me." When he returned home with the jars full of water, his stepmother stared at him in amazement. He had not been gone long enough to obtain it from the farther spring. "Where did you get this water?" she asked, as soon as she could find words with which to speak. Pedro told her that it came from the spring, just as it always did. "That spring is dry today," she cried. "Now I know that you are a liar, as well as a thief. Just wait until your father comes home. I'll see that you get the beating you deserve." Pedro wondered why she had sent him to the spring if she had believed it to be dry, and while he was thinking of this the angry woman gave him a big basket. "Here," she said, "go out in the garden and pick up some wood for me. Hurry, don't keep me waiting. Your slow ways drive me mad." Pedro knew that all the wood in the garden had been picked up long ago. Now there was nothing in the garden except roses. There were red roses, and pink roses, and yellow roses, and white roses, but not a single stick of wood. High up on the steep slopes of Monte Brasil there might be wood to gather, but the night was dark and the path was steep and long. Little Pedro was very tired, so tired that two great tears rolled down his cheeks. Suddenly the good Saint Anthony from the little chapel stood before him. He smiled kindly at the child. "Why are you crying, my boy?" asked the saint. "I have watched you carefully for a long time, and I know you seldom give way to tears, though often your burdens are so heavy that a boy less brave would do little else than weep." "I have to fill my basket with wood, and there is nothing except roses in our garden," replied Pedro. "I'm tired, and it is very dark on Monte Brasil to search there for wood." "Here, dear boy," said the saint, smiling. "Just pick the roses and fill your basket with them. Then take them to your stepmother and see what she will say to you. I'll be with you." Pedro filled his big basket with the lovely red and yellow and pink and white roses which grew in the garden in such rich abundance. Then he ran into the house with them. As the light of the candles fell upon them, to his amazement he saw that they were no longer roses. The basket was full of wood. "Where did you get this wood?" cried the woman angrily. "There are only roses in the garden. Where have you been?" She seized Pedro roughly by the collar of his new coat and shook him until his teeth chattered. He looked up into the saint's eyes. Saint Anthony's face was stern. "Stop, woman!" cried the voice which a moment before had been so kind and gentle. Now it thundered forth in stern accents. "This little lad has done no harm. You have been guilty of a desire to bring harm to him. For this cruelty take the punishment which you so richly merit. It is you who have sent this child out into the night. Now it is I who sends you out into the night." From that moment Pedro's stepmother was no longer a woman. She was changed into an owl, with her eyes the big round circles they had looked when she had gazed up into the fierce face of angry Saint Anthony. To this very day the owl has to fly by night. End of chapter 25, while the owl flies at night.
Chapter 26 of The Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. Chapter 26. The Laborer and His Master. The story of a man who outfitted another. Once upon a time there was a laborer who said to his master, "It is time to plant the fields." "Very well," said his master. "The part which grows above the ground shall be mine, and you shall have in payment for your labor the part which grows below the ground." "Agreed," said the laborer. He planted the fields with potatoes. His master had nothing but the tops outside the earth. The laborer harvested many baskets of potatoes that year, and sold them for a goodly sum. The master was angry because of this. "Next harvest time," said he, "we'll see about things. You shall give me what grows below the ground, and keep for yourself what grows above." "Agreed," said the laborer. "That is perfectly fair to me." The laborer planted the fields with wheat. His master had nothing but the roots, while he harvested a rich crop of wheat, which he sold for much money. "I'll settle with you," said his master. The laborer was frightened. "Don't be afraid," said his wife. "When your master comes let me talk to him." The woman gashed her face and hands with the pruning knife. The master came to the door and she opened it. "Where is your husband?" he asked. "He is sharpening his nails," said she. "See what ugly scratches I already have upon my hands and face." The master went away without punishing the laborer. End of chapter 26. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. Chapter 27. 'Tis Faith which Saves. The Story of a Maid who was betrothed to one she trusted. There was once upon a time a fair maid who lived in the island of Fayal. She was betrothed to a young man of the same island. One day she fell ill with a disease which baffled the skill of all physicians. Their arts, the mourning of her betrothed, the prayers and tears of her mother, all seemed to no avail. It appeared that the fair maid would die. Now it happened that in one of the nearby islands, St. Michael, there was a miracle-working image called the Santo Cristo. The fair maid begged of her betrothed that he would go to St. Michael and procure some of the mysterious, miracle-working sweat of the Santo Cristo, or some of the miraculous parings of the nails of the image, which had the power to heal any disease. The young man gladly set out on the quest. On the boat which conveyed him to St. Michael, however, he met a maid with beauty and charm, a maid whose bright eyes made him forget the sad eyes of his betrothed. When he arrived at his destination, he thought only of singing gay songs beneath the balcony of his new love. The days flew by, and soon it was time for the boat to return to Fayal. He had forgotten the mission on which he had come, and he returned to the boat with no relics of the miracle-working Santo Cristo. The homeward journey was rough and stormy. Filled with fear of death at any moment, the young man remembered the fair maid of Fayal, who even at that very hour might be dying. His conscience smote him. "Oh, why did I allow another fair face to crowd out from my heart the image of my beloved?" he asked himself. "Faithless wretch that I am! What shall I say to my betrothed if good fortune and the sea permit me to stand once more at her side?" The rough waves beat angrily against the side of the boat in answer. That night the storm ceased, and in the morning it was fair and clear as the boat entered the beautiful harbor of Fayal, under the shadow of Mount Pico. With clear skies and smooth seas the young man's conscience became less troublesome. He resolved that he would not confess his deceit to his betrothed. "If I told her, it might make her grow worse so rapidly that she would die because of it," he said to himself. Indeed, it was quite enough to have made the girl die of a broken heart, had she known the whole story. Suddenly the youth's face clouded. "What shall I say to my beloved as the reason why I have brought back to her neither the miracle-working sweat of the Santo Cristo, nor the miraculous nail parings?" he was asking. His eye fell upon the boat's wooden side. Quickly he shaved off some fine parings of this wood. He wrapped them up carefully, and took them to the fair maid of Fayal, as if they were parings from the nails of the miracle-working image. His betrothed's face shone with joy at his return. Tears of thankfulness filled her eyes when she saw the parings which he had brought her. "How can I ever thank you for your faithfulness in this quest on my behalf, and the great love which prompted you to undertake this stormy, dangerous journey on the rough seas, that I might once more be well?" The young man did not enjoy hearing her speak of his love and faithfulness. He did not reply. "No maid was ever blessed with so wonderful a lover," went on the happy girl. "You are forgetting to take the parings," said the mother. "They will not cure you if you do not take them." The fair maid of Fayal took the parings in a gourd full of water. She began to improve immediately, and the next day she was entirely well. "'Tis faith which saves, and not parings," said her betrothed. Chapter 27. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah.
Of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. Chapter 28. St. Brendan's Island. The story of the little maid who found it. There was once an Irish monk called St. Brendan. One day he received a visit from a hermit who told him of a most marvelous island. "Come and visit this earthly paradise," said the hermit. "The sun always shines. The birds wear golden crowns upon their heads and speak like humans." The perfume of the island clung to the garments of the hermit for 40 days. Good St. Brendan asked many questions about the mysterious island, and at last resolved to visit it and see for himself if all the wonders of which he had heard were really true. Accordingly, he built a coracle of wattle covered with hides tanned in oak bark and softened with butter. He loaded it with provisions to last for 40 days. Then he persuaded some of his disciples to accompany him. This was somewhat difficult, for they were timid about embarking upon this dangerous expedition in the frail boat. St. Brendan, however, succeeded in overcoming their fears and set out with a little group of his most devoted followers. It was 7 years before they returned to their native land. They were even more enthusiastic about their wonderful island than the hermit had been. They urged others to go and find out its marvels, but nobody else was ever able to locate it. They say that the island of St. Brendan was a floating island in the Atlantic. Good St. Brendan did not die, but kept on living in the earthly paradise of his isle. When the Christians were hard pressed in their battles with the Moors, and were about to be pushed back into the sea, the island of St. Brendan appeared upon the horizon, and the good saint himself came to fight against the Moors and bring victory to the Christians. In the middle of the 15th century there was a little maid called Maria, who lived in the island of Terceira. She heard the story of St. Brendan's Isle from a Franciscan brother. Day and night she dreamed of it. She often sat upon the hillside of Monte Brasil, looking eagerly out over the broad expanse of sea, hoping with all her heart that the island would appear to her. One day there landed in Terceira a cavalier of Rhodes named Vital. From his grandfather he had inherited some of the sacred relics of St. Brendan. He had come to the Azores in his search for the mysterious island. On his doublet he wore an 8-pointed star and a band upon which was embroidered in scarlet silk the motto, "By Faith." It was indeed by faith that he had embarked upon his quest. The little maid, Maria, fell in love with him the moment she heard of him and his errand. She worshipped him as if he had been the good St. Brendan himself, but when she was with him she sat with downcast eyes, her long dark eyelashes sweeping her delicate cheek, and did not give him a glance, much less a word. The young cavalier loved the little maid. He divided his holy relics of St. Brendan with her, and in return he begged of her that she might speak a word of love. "To tell my love to you," said Maria, "I'd have to be where nobody but God could hear." Indeed, it was quite true that Maria needed to be where nobody but the good God could hear her when she spoke of her love for the cavalier Vital. The son of the wealthy captain of the district had long admired her delicate beauty. He had already sought her for his bride. His jealousy against Vital rose up like a burning flame. He went to Maria and demanded that she should marry him at once. Maria firmly refused. "If you do not wed me," said the captain's son, "I shall have my father lock you up in the stronghold of St. Louis on the hillside." "I should prefer to spend all my days confined in the castle of St. Louis rather than be your wife," said she. "Why can't you leave me in peace with my relics of the good St. Brendan?" The mention of St. Brendan's relics stirred the young man's wrath even more. He well knew who it was who had given her the holy relics. His threat was fulfilled, and she was taken that very day to the castle of St. Louis and locked up in that stronghold. Her room had a window, and there she sat high up in the tower of the castle looking down at the city of Angra beneath her. "I had longed to serve the good God," she cried. "Why is it that my life has been made useless?" At that very moment the earth trembled. The strong walls of the castle shook as if they had been built of paper. Near the fort 2 doves were sitting on the branches of a cedar tree. "Let us rescue this fair maid," said one dove to the other. "Yes, let us carry her away on our wings," agreed the other. That instant the earth shook so that the walls of the stronghold fell to the ground. The 2 doves spread out their snow white wings and bore Maria away in safety. Over houses and churches they flew. Over tree tops and the broad expanse of the sea they rose. The city, the island, the sea, all disappeared from Maria's sight. She felt so dizzy that she closed her eyes. When she opened them again she was in such an island of such beauty as she had never dreamed. It was indeed a garden of paradise. The good St. Brendan himself, she saw, was the gardener. The earthquake caused much damage on the island of Terceira. When the disappearance of Maria was known throughout the little city of Angra, nobody mourned for her as did the young cavalier Vital. "What is the island to me without Maria?" he asked in sorrow. Once more he embarked upon the sea in his search for the island of St. Brendan. Long days and long nights he tossed about on the ocean. One evening, just at sunset, he saw the clouds of heaven descending to earth like a white ladder. Then he observed, far away upon the horizon, an island. He knew in his heart that he had at last a glimpse of St. Brendan's Isle. A gentle breeze swelled his sails and sent him rapidly toward it. As he drew near he saw his loved Maria standing with her arms outstretched. A bright light shone about her. "To speak of my love to you," said she, "I have to be where nobody but God can hear. God and the gardener of this island, St. Brendan." End of St. Brendan's Island.
Chapter 29 of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Krantz. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. The Silent Cavalier. The Story of the Peach Tree. In the early days, when the Azores had just been discovered, there were many Flemish settlers who came to the islands. Among them there was a young cavalier of the order of St. George of Borgogne. His name was Jesus Maria, and the reason why he had come was because a wise monk had told him that his path in life lay by way of the sea. "Your name given to you in holy baptism," said the monk, "is Jesus Maria. Transpose the letters, and it says in Latin, Maris es via." The young cavalier agreed that the sea must be his path of destiny, and he at once set sail upon a long voyage, which finally led him to the island of Fayal. He loved the rocky coast where the waves beat. He loved the deep ravine where the laughing brook ran, the lake and the ancient crater, the snow-capped summit of Mount Pico, which smiled down in stately majesty from the opposite island. He decided that this was to be his home. "My path of destiny was indeed the sea," he said. "The sea has brought me to a country which is very fair." In the island of Fayal there were already some Portuguese settlers. One of these had a beautiful daughter, Ida. The young Flemish cavalier thought that she was the fairest maid he had ever seen. He fell deeply in love with her. Now the cavaliers of the order of St. George of Borgogne had vowed that they would never wed. Jesus Maria could not break the solemn pledge which he had given when he joined the order. Neither could he forget the bright eyes of the Portuguese maiden, Ida. It seemed as if his heart would break. "I will leave this island and return to my own country," he thought. Then he remembered the words which the wise monk had said about the sea being his path. He had followed that road, and it had led him to a fair island home. He decided that he could not return to his native land of Flanders. Over across the shining blue water he looked up at the peaceful snow-capped summit of Mount Pico. The sight of its majestic stillness seemed to give him strength to hold his tongue and keep him from speaking words of love to the beautiful Portuguese maiden. Never a word of love broke from him. The maiden Ida never knew the shrine she occupied in the heart of the Flemish cavalier. The days dragged slowly by. The young man could bear no more. He felt that his strength could no longer endure on the same island with Ida. If he stayed near her he would break his vow. One morning in a little boat he crossed the blue waters to the island of Pico. At the foot of the majestic mountain he loved, he built the little hut which was to be his home. He never returned to the island of Fayal, and as the years went by he was spoken of as the good hermit of Pico. Nobody knew his secret. When at last the cavalier Jesus Maria died, a peach tree grew from his tomb, the emblem of silence. The leaf of this tree has the form of the human tongue. Its fruit has a stone shaped somewhat like the human heart. From this stone there comes a seed, which when planted produces a new tree. Thus it is that words which bear fruit spring from the heart. It is silence which teaches one the gift of fruitful words, they say in the Azores. End of The Silent Cavalier. Recording by Pamela Krantz.
Of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. The Enchanted Palace. The Story of Lake Ginjal. In the village of Altos Ares, in the island of Terceira, there lived once upon a time a fair maid who had been baptized Perola which means pearl. As she grew older she was indeed like a rare pearl among the other maidens of the village, so great was the charm of her unusual beauty. She was the joy of her home and the whole community, for her disposition was as lovely as her face. One bright spring morning Perola leaned over the cistern where she had gone to get water. Her reflection showed so plainly in the water that she paused to gaze into the smiling eyes of her own mirrored face. As she did so a magic spell was woven about her. The water fairy who had come to the cistern had seen her great beauty, and had thrown a charm over her. In a moment more she fell into the cistern to join her reflection there. When Perola could not be found, there was great excitement in the little village. Nobody could guess what had become of her. Her mother prayed devoutly for her safety in the church of St. Rogue. All the villagers sought for her in every possible place. Now at the north of the island of Terceira there were groups of tiny rocks in the sea, which are called the biscotos, or biscuits. Here there lived a wise old woman, who had a great reputation among all the people of the island for her knowledge. "Let us go to consult the wise woman of Biscoitos," said one of the village youths, when they had sought long and faithfully for a trace of the hiding place into which Perola might have vanished. Accordingly the young men of Altos Ares went to the wise woman, and this is what she told them: "The fair pearl of your village is safe from the fishers of pearls. She is hidden away in an enchanted palace of marble and ivory and tortoise shell and mother of pearl." The water fairy had taken Perola through an underground passage which led from the cistern to the beautiful enchanted palace in the lake of Ginjal. There she was kept in hiding. The fairies never dreamed that anybody would ever be able to guess where she was. Now, with the words of the wise woman of Biscoitos to guide them, the youths of Altos Ares organized an expedition to search for their lost playmate. The sons of the magistrate, the rich men, the learned men of the island of Terceira joined this expedition. They searched through the whole island for a place where an enchanted palace might be located. At last, upon St. John's Day, when the days and nights are of equal length, this band of the brave youths of Terceira came to the shores of Lake Ginjal in the interior of the island. "This is surely the enchanted place. Here in this lake must lie the fairy's palace of marble and ivory and tortoise shell and mother of pearl," somebody cried. "How shall we be able to approach this magic palace and rescue Perola?" asked one. "How shall we be able to break her enchantment?" asked another. "Let us camp here upon the border of the lake and consider how best to proceed," said the leader of the expedition. Now at that very hour on St. John's Day the mother of Perola was in the church of St. Rogue in Altos Ares, praying devoutly for her daughter's safe return. Suddenly she heard a strange voice. These were the words which fell upon her ears: "Your prayers and the perseverance of the youths of this island have at last triumphed. Go in peace. On the day of St. Peter, at the hour of sunset, your daughter shall be restored to you. Her enchantment shall be broken, and she shall be brought to the bank of Lake Ginjal in a boat of ivory, drawn by a snow-white swan." When the youths encamped upon the shore of the lake heard these tidings, they set up such a shout of joy that it was indeed enough to break any enchantment. At the time appointed, Perola was brought to the bank of the lake in a boat of ivory, drawn by a snow-white swan, just as lovely and fair as upon the day when she had vanished from the little village of Altos Ares. This is the story of the lake of Ginjal. It is quite probable that the enchanted palace of the water fairies is still there. End of The Enchanted Palace, the story of Lake Ginjal. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah.
Of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Ells. Chapter 31. The Friend of the Devil. A Story of the Islands in the Bay of Angra. Once upon a time there was a handsome Flemish youth who came to the island of Fayal. His name was Fernão de Hutra. He fell in love with a beautiful nun in the convent of the Gloria in the city of Hortra. One day the devil appeared to him. "Since you fell in love with this fair nun, I see you are a friend of mine," said the devil. The young man had not known this, but he replied, "Say rather that I will be your friend if you help me get possession of this nun I love." "Very well," said the devil, "but you will have to make a bargain with me." "What is it?" asked Fernão, rather anxiously. "Grant me your solemn pledge that you'll give me all your children," responded the devil. "Agreed," said Fernão. After that he saw much of the devil. The nun, however, was as devout as she was beautiful. She refused to break the vow she had made and flee with the Flemish youth. She firmly resisted both him and the devil. "You are not a true friend to me after all," said Fernão to the devil sadly. "But you are my friend," said the devil in reply. Soon after, Fernão de Hutra left the city of Hortra and the island Fayal, and went to join his kinsmen who had settled in Angra, in the island of Terceira. Here his handsome face won many friends for him among the youth of the city. To some of these he confided the story of his relations with the devil. Now it happened that in the year 1666 the first bullfight was held in Angra. To this very day the island of Terceira is the only one in the Azores which has bullfights. Fernão had taken part in this. He was one of the chief organizers of the bullfight held on St. John's Day of the following year. That day all the men and women and children of the city of Angra assembled in the public square before the fort. The bullfighters, richly clad, rode forth upon prancing steeds decked in costly velvets with streamers and ribbons of gold and silver which sparkled in the bright sunlight. The youths were resplendent in their garments of crimson or purple or blue velvet richly embroidered. Fernão de Hutra was radiant in his jacket of blue decked with pearls, with a plumed hat upon his handsome head. He carried a yellow banner embroidered with the arms of his family. Gay music sounded, the bulls were brought into the ring, the bullfighters saluted, and the fight began. In the windows of the castle the daughters of the chief magistrate of the city of Angra were seated among their friends. The eldest daughter, Sophia, was the most beautiful maid of the whole city. The magistrate watched her anxiously as her fair cheek alternately paled and flushed as the struggle went on. There could be no doubt about the fact that there was love in her eyes as they rested upon the handsome young Flemish cavalier Fernão de Hutra. She was wearing his colors, and in her hand she carefully held his bouquet of flowers. The ribbon which tied them secured also a piece of paper upon which were written these words: "O beautiful maid of my heart's desire, for your dear sake I'd go through fire." The magistrate withdrew from the gay scene into the silence of the great hall of the castle. He bowed his head upon his hands. "This youth is the friend of the devil," he groaned. "I cannot consent to my daughter's marriage to him. He has promised to give all his children to the devil, they say. I cannot allow my own grandchildren to be given to the devil." That very day he began to plot how to get rid of the handsome young Fernão. Now in the bay before the city of Angra there are 2 rocky islands called today, just as they were then, the Ilheos de Cabras, the island of goats. The brother-in-law of the magistrate was the owner of these barren islands. There were a few goats there, a few mulberry bushes, and a tiny spring of fresh water. The magistrate called his brother-in-law to him as soon as the bullfight was over. He told him all his fears, and asked if he might use the islands as a place of banishment for the young Flemish cavalier, who was the friend of the devil. "You are quite welcome to use these islands for so worthy a purpose," replied his brother-in-law. "Indeed, I have often thought that the deep cave on the island led into Inferno. It is a most fitting spot for the habitation of the devil's friend. Thus it happened that the handsome young Flemish cavalier was seized and borne away to the barren rocky islands in the Bay of Angra. When he was received there, a great earthquake shook the whole island of Terceira. When at last the people of the city of Angra were through contemplating all the destruction which had been wrought, someone looked in the direction of the island of goats. They saw that a great piece had been broken away from one of the islands. Thus it was that the devil received his friend. End of chapter 31. The Friend of the Devil. Narrated by Samuel Perry.
Chapter 32 of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. The Miller's Cloak. The story of a man who tried to stay home from church. There was once a pious miller. He was always to be found in the church, praying. He prayed for the dead. He prayed for those who were alive. He prayed for all who suffered, for the homeless ones, for the hungry ones. He prayed for those upon the sea and those upon the land. Now it happened that a terrible storm smote the island. The sea beat high against the rocky coast. Lightning flashed, thunder roared, the wind howled. The rain fell in torrents as if it were a flood. "Don't go out in the storm to-night," counselled his wife. "It is not a suitable night for one to go to church." "I agree with you," replied the miller. "I do not need to go to the church in this fierce storm. Surely my prayers of other days and nights have been so many that to-night I have earned rest in my own dry house. The good God will pardon me." The miller wrapped his heavy brown cloak about him and lay down upon his bed. The wind shrieked, thunder shook the earth, unseen hands pulled the miller's cloak from off his bed. "The wind has blown out the candle, light another," cried the miller to his wife. By the dim light of the candle the good miller again arranged his bed. He wrapped his heavy mantle about him and once more tried to sleep. Again his cloak was pulled from off his bed as if by unseen hands. There was no rest for the miller that night. His cloak could not be made to cover him as he laid upon his bed. "I might as well go to the church and pray," he told his wife. "I can't rest here." He wrapped himself in the brown cloak and went out to the church through the fierce, blinding storm. He prayed for the dead. He prayed for those who were alive. He prayed for all who suffered, for the homeless ones, the hungry ones. He prayed for those upon the sea, for those upon the land. "Surely the prayers of the pious are needed this night," said the miller to his wife when he came in out of the fierce storm. Lightning flashed, thunder roared, the rain fell in torrents, the wind howled and drove the pouring rain against the windows. It blew in sheets through the door before the miller had time to close it behind him. The storm beat upon the thatched roof as if it would carry it away. "Quick, your cloak!" cried the miller's wife. "Take it off that I may dry it by the fire." The good man started to obey. As he touched his cloak, however, his eyes opened wide in amazement. It was entirely dry. "Feel it yourself," he said to his wife. "There is not a drop of rain upon it." The miller's wife discovered that his words were true. "It is a miracle of God," cried she, as she crossed herself. End of The Miller's Cloak.
Of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Pamela Krantz. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. The Magic Mouthful. The story of a woman who quarreled. Once upon a time there was a woman who lived a most unhappy life. She and her husband were always quarreling. Every day when he came home from work he was cross, and said harsh words to her. She would respond with bitter words, and things would go from bad to worse, until at last he would beat her. One day the woman took her water jar and went to the fountain to fill it as usual. She was so unhappy that great tears were rolling down her cheeks. There was a little old woman standing by the fountain. "What is the matter, my daughter?" she asked, as she saw the tears upon the poor woman's cheeks. When she had heard all the story, the little old woman took the water jar and filled it at the fountain. "Go home, my daughter," she said. "Keep this water in the jar. The moment your husband says a cross word to you, fill your mouth with the water." The sad woman thanked her and went to her own house. The next day when her husband came home he began to scold as usual. She was about to reply when she suddenly remembered the old woman's advice. She ran to the water jar and filled her mouth with water. To her great amazement her husband soon stopped scolding. That night, for the first time in many weeks, she went to sleep without a beating. Things kept on going well for several days. Just as soon as her husband came home cross and said unpleasant things, she would fill her mouth with water from the jar. Then he would get over being cross. Now there were smiles instead of tears on the woman's face. At last, however, the water jar grew empty. Once more the woman went to the fountain, hoping that she would again find the little old woman who had given her the magic water. She found her waiting at the fountain. "How did my prescription succeed, dear daughter?" she asked as soon as she saw her. "How can I ever thank you for all you have done for me?" cried the woman. "Now I am happy once more. My husband no longer beats me. I did not dream that my life could ever be so full of joy. Give me, I pray you, some more of the magic water." The little old woman smiled gently. "Dear daughter," she said, "the water which I put in your jar is nothing but the water from this fountain. It is the very same which you always carry home. This is the secret. When your mouth is full of water, you cannot reply when your husband says cross words to you. If you do not keep up the quarrel, it soon ends. That is why your life is happy now instead of sad. Go home, and whenever your husband says an unkind word, pretend that your mouth is full of water and do not reply. Go in peace, my child." The woman always remembered this good advice and never again quarreled with her husband. When she had children of her own, she passed on to them the secret. Now it is generally known in the Azores that if one does not want to keep up a quarrel, it is well to pretend that his mouth is full of water. This is the reason why the people of the islands are so peaceful and happy. End of the Magic Mouthful. Recording by Pamela Krantz.
Of the Islands of Magic. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells. The Messengers. The story of a youth who met death. There lived once upon a time in the island of Terceira a youth whose name was Vladimiro. He had come from Flanders, a cavalier of the order of St. John. He was betrothed to a fair maid of the island. One morning He was hunting in the forest of cedars when he suddenly saw Death standing before him. He fell upon his knees and sent up a fervent prayer to the Holy Virgin. Then he said to Death, "O Death, why is it that you have come in search of me so soon? I am young, rich, happy. I am betrothed to a maid who loves me. Life looks very bright and fair." Death stepped back a pace. "Your prayer to the Holy Mother has saved you," he said. "I had indeed come in search of you. You were about to die from an accident with your hunting arms. See, I have already retreated a pace. I have decided not to take you with me this time." Vladimiro returned a prayer of thanksgiving. Then he said, "Oh, Death, I'm going to make a request of you. Please do not come up to me so suddenly again. It gives me a fright. Next time you come for me, will you please be so kind as to send messengers in advance to give me a little warning?" "Yes, young cavalier," responded Death, "I will gladly do what you ask. I give you my promise that next time I will send my messengers ahead of me to warn you that I am approaching." With these words Death withdrew and went on alone through the forest of cedars. The spring of that very year the young cavalier married the fair maid who loved him. Life was full of joy. Many children were born to the worthy couple. Riches and honors came too. The years sped by as if they flew on wings. At last a half-century had passed. Vladimiro held his grandchildren upon his knees and told them the story of the day he met Death in the forest of cedars. "We are glad that Death passed on and left you," said the children. "If he hadn't, we could not have had you for our grandfather," said the namesake grandson Vladimiro, snuggling closer in his arms. "You do not have to fear Death now, grandfather, do you?" asked the little Maria. "He will keep his promise and send his messengers, don't you think so?" "Yes, Death is a good Christian and will keep his word," replied the aged cavalier. The next morning he set sail for the island of Fayal, where there were other grandchildren to visit in the home of his married daughter Francisca. On the voyage a fierce storm arose. The small boat was buffeted about by the gales. Suddenly Vladimiro was startled to see Death standing beside him just as in the forest years ago when he had been young. "Why have you come today?" he cried in alarm. "Why is it that you have not kept your word? You gave me your promise that you would send your messengers next time you came, to warn me of your approach." "I have kept my word," said Death. "I have sent my messengers." "Where are they?" asked the old man in amazement. Death pointed to Vladimiro's snowy hair. "I have sent my messengers in your white locks, your failing eyesight and hearing, the wrinkles on your cheeks. Can it be that you have failed to recognize them?" Vladimiro bowed his head in silence and without a murmur went with Death. In truth, Death had been a good Christian and had kept his word. End of The Messengers. Recording by Jessica Louise, St. Paul, Minnesota. End of The Islands of Magic by Elsie Spicer Eells.